The cold metal floors of mining colony Kepler 442b rang with the sound of heavy boots. Commander Zethkar walked through the human quarters with slow, measured steps. His reptilian eyes scanned the cramped living spaces where human families huddled together. The smell of fear hung in the air like a thick fog. Zethkar was proud of that smell. Fear was the tool that kept the Zarathi Empire strong. For 300 years, his people had ruled over hundreds of worlds. They had learned that terror worked better than any weapon. When people were afraid, they obeyed. When they obeyed, the empire grew stronger. The humans were still new to this life. Only 50 years had passed since the great Zarathi fleets had appeared in Earth's sky. The humans had fought back, of course. They always did at first. But their small ships and simple weapons were no match for Zarathi power. The war had lasted only 3 months before Earth surrendered. Now the humans served as workers in the mines and factories across the empire. Zethkar had been told they were weak creatures driven by useless emotions. They cried when their loved ones died. They shared food even when they were hungry. They told stories to their children about better times. Such foolish behavior. Marcus Reeves knelt in the darkness of Tunnel 7, 2 miles below the surface. His hands were raw from digging, and his lungs burned from the toxic dust that filled the air. Around him, other human miners worked in silence. Speaking during work shifts was forbidden. The Zarathi guards carried shock weapons that could drop a man in seconds. Marcus had been an engineer once back on Earth. He had designed defense systems and built machines that could think. Now he dug rocks from alien soil with tools that barely worked. The irony was not lost on him. The Zarathi used human-designed technology in their ships and weapons, but they treated humans like animals. As he worked, Marcus thought about his family waiting in the quarters above. His wife Elena ran a small medical station where she treated injured workers with whatever supplies she could find. Their daughter Sarah was 8 years old, born after the conquest. She had never seen Earth, never run through green fields or felt rain on her face. But Sarah was special. Even in this dark place, she found reasons to smile. She shared her small food portions with hungry children. She drew pictures on the walls with bits of charcoal. She sang old Earth songs that her mother had taught her. The other families loved her for it. Zethkar did not love her for it. That evening, Sarah sat in the common area where families gathered after work. Around her, adults spoke in quiet voices about the day's hardships. Children sat close to their parents, trying not to cry from hunger or fear. Sarah had found a piece of metal that shined like silver. She used it to scratch a picture on the wall, a tree with many branches and leaves. Under it, she drew people holding hands. "What is that?" asked Tommy, a boy who had lost his father in a mining accident last week. "It's a tree from Earth," Sarah said. "My mama told me about them. They grow tall and give shade to people who are tired." "But there are no trees here," said another child. Sarah smiled. "Maybe not real ones, but we can make our own. We can be like a tree for each other, strong and giving shade when someone needs it." An old woman named Mrs. Chen watched Sarah from across the room. She had lived through the conquest of Earth. She had seen the Zarathi ships burn entire cities to make their point. But watching this little girl draw hope on a wall made her remember something she thought was lost forever. Other species worked in the colony too. The Threnodi were insect-like creatures with 6 arms and large compound eyes. They had been conquered 200 years ago and had long since accepted their fate. They worked in the dangerous chemical processing areas where their natural immunity to toxins kept them alive. The lumens were beings made of living crystal who could store and release energy. They powered the colony's machines with their bodies, standing motionless for hours while electricity flowed through them. Their kind had been enslaved for over a century. Both species had heard the human stories of Earth. They had seen the pictures Sarah drew. Something about the humans was different from other conquered races. Most species eventually stopped fighting and stopped hoping, but humans seemed unable to stop being human. Commander Zethkar reviewed the daily reports in his office. Production numbers were good. No major accidents or rebellions. The workers were staying in line, but there was something in the reports that bothered him. The security cameras had recorded unusual gatherings in the human quarters. People sharing food when they should be hoarding it. Adults teaching children to read using materials that should have been destroyed. Worst of all, they were telling stories about their home world and singing songs. The Zarathi had learned that destroying a people's culture was just as important as destroying their military. When people forgot who they used to be, they stopped dreaming of who they could become again, but these humans seemed determined to remember. Zethkar's attention focused on one name that appeared in several reports: Sarah Reeves. The 8-year-old daughter of 2 workers. Security recordings showed her at the center of most human gatherings. She was teaching other children games from Earth. She was drawing pictures that reminded people of their lost home. She was making people smile. This was dangerous. The next day, Sarah organized something that made Zethkar's blood run cold with anger. One of the Threnody workers had died from chemical exposure. The alien had no family, no friends among his own kind. He would normally have been disposed of without ceremony, but Sarah convinced the humans to hold a memorial service. She stood in the center of the common area and spoke about how the Threnody worker had always been kind to the human children. She said that being conquered did not mean they had to stop caring about each other. Other species joined the service. Lumens glowed softly in tribute. Threnody workers clicked their mandibles in a rhythm that sounded almost like music. For the first time in decades, different species had come together for something other than work or survival. Zethkar watched the recording of the service 3 times. Each time his rage grew hotter. This was exactly how rebellion started, not with weapons or violence, but with hope. With people remembering that they were more than just workers and slaves, he called for his security chief. "The child, Sarah Reeves," he said. "She is becoming a problem." "Sir, she is only 8 years old. Surely she poses no real threat." Zethkar's eyes narrowed. "On the Zerathi homeworld we have a saying, kill the spark before it becomes a fire. This human child is teaching others to hope. Hope leads to resistance. Resistance leads to rebellion. What are your orders, sir?" "Tomorrow, during the morning inspection, we will make an example. The workers need to remember their place." That night, Sarah fell asleep between her parents in their small sleeping area. She dreamed of trees and sunshine and a world where people did not have to be afraid. She did not know that in the morning, Commander Zethkar would change everything. She did not know that her death would light a fire that would burn across the galaxy. Outside their quarters, the moons of Kepler 442b cast pale light through the narrow windows. In the distance, the Zerathi fortress stood like a dark mountain against the stars. Inside its walls, Commander Zethkar prepared for the lesson he would teach the next day. He believed, as all Zerathi did, that fear was the perfect tool for control. He believed that by killing one innocent child, he would crush the spirit of all the others. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Morning came too soon to mining colony Kepler 442b. The artificial lights flickered on at exactly 0600 hours, bathing the human quarters in harsh white glare. Sarah Reeves woke up with a smile as she did every morning. Today she had planned to teach the younger children a new song her mother had remembered from Earth. Marcus and Elena Reeves moved quietly around their small living space, preparing for another day of work. They had learned to speak in whispers during the morning routine. Sound carried far in the metal corridors, and the Zerathi guards were always listening. "Mama," Sarah whispered, "can you tell me again about the flowers that grew on Earth?" Elena's heart clenched. She had told Sarah about roses and daisies, about gardens where children could run and play without fear. But sometimes she wondered if filling her daughter's head with such dreams was cruel. This cold mining world was all Sarah had ever known. "They came in many colors," Elena whispered back, brushing her daughter's dark hair, red and yellow and purple, "and they smelled like sweetness itself." Sarah's eyes lit up. "When I grow up, maybe I can find seeds and grow flowers here. Even in the dark places, maybe they could grow if we sang to them." Marcus looked at his daughter with pride and pain mixed together. She was so much like Elena had been when they first met, full of hope and determination to make the world better. But this was not a world that rewarded such feelings. The morning inspection came earlier than usual. Commander Zethkar arrived with a full squad of Zerathi guards, their shock weapons ready. This was strange. Normal inspections involved only 2 or 3 guards checking for contraband or signs of rebellion. All the workers were ordered to gather in the central common area. Humans, Threnody, and Lumens stood in nervous groups while the Zerathi soldiers positioned themselves around the room. The air felt heavy with tension. Sarah stood between her parents, holding her mother's hand. She was not afraid yet. She trusted that as long as she stayed close to her family, everything would be all right. Commander Zethkar walked to the center of the room. His cold reptilian eyes swept over the crowd. When his gaze fell on Sarah, she felt a chill run down her spine for the first time. "Workers of Colony Kepler 442b," Zethkar announced in his harsh voice. "You have forgotten your place. You have been gathering without permission. You have been teaching forbidden knowledge to your children. You have been holding ceremonies for the dead." The crowd shifted nervously. Several humans looked toward Sarah without meaning to. She was the one who had organized the memorial service. She was the one who taught the children old Earth songs and games. "Such behavior threatens the order and stability of this colony," Zethkar continued. "The Zarathi Empire has ruled for 3 centuries because we do not tolerate defiance. Not from adults. Not from children. Not from anyone." Sarah felt her father's hand rest protectively on her shoulder. Marcus's military training told him that something terrible was about to happen. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. "Sarah Reeves," Zethkar called out. "Step forward." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Parents pulled their children closer. The Threnody workers made clicking sounds of distress. Even the lumens, who rarely showed emotion, began to glow with agitated energy. "No," Elena whispered. "She's just a child." "Step forward," Zethkar repeated louder this time. Sarah looked up at her parents with confusion in her dark eyes. She had done nothing wrong that she could think of. She had shared food with hungry children. She had drawn pictures to make people smile. She had organized a service for a dead worker because it seemed like the right thing to do. "It's okay," she whispered to her mother, trying to comfort her as tears began to flow down Elena's face. "I'll be brave." Sarah walked slowly toward Commander Zethkar. Her small feet made tiny sounds on the metal floor. The entire room held its breath. "This child," Zethkar announced, "has been spreading dangerous ideas. She teaches other children to remember Earth. She encourages hope where there should be acceptance. She makes people believe they are more than what they are." He pulled out his personal weapon, a sleek Zarathi energy pistol that could kill instantly. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," he said. "Hope is a disease. Dreams are rebellion. And rebellion has consequences." Marcus lunged forward, but 2 guards grabbed him before he could reach his daughter. Elena screamed and tried to follow, but more guards blocked her way. The other workers pressed forward, but shock weapons fired into the crowd, dropping several people to the ground. Sarah looked back at her parents one last time. She was afraid now, but she tried to be brave like the heroes in the stories her mother had told her. "I forgive you," she said to Commander Zethkar in her small, clear voice. The words hit him like a slap. In 300 years of Zarathi conquest, no one had ever said such a thing to him. Enemies cursed him. Victims begged for mercy, but this small human child offered forgiveness. "What did you say?" he demanded. "I forgive you," Sarah repeated. "You must be very sad inside to want to hurt people. My mama says that hurt people sometimes hurt other people, but it doesn't have to be that way." For a moment something flickered in Zethkar's eyes. Then his training took over. He was Zarathi. He was a conqueror. He did not need forgiveness from a human child. He pulled the trigger. The energy beam struck Sarah in the chest. She fell backward onto the cold metal floor, her small body suddenly still. The last thing she saw was her parents reaching for her across an impossible distance. The silence that followed was complete and terrible. 200 beings stood frozen in shock and grief.
Children began to cry.
Adults made sounds of anguish that came from depths they did not know they possessed. Elena's scream echoed off the metal walls. It was a sound that would haunt everyone who heard it for the rest of their lives. Marcus fell to his knees, his engineer's mind unable to process what had just happened. Commander Zethkar looked down at Sarah's body with satisfaction. The lesson had been taught. The workers would remember this day whenever they thought about stepping out of line. But as he looked around the room, he saw something that made him pause. The faces staring back at him were not filled with the fear he expected. They were filled with something else, something cold and hard and dangerous. The Threnody workers had stopped their usual nervous clicking. They stood perfectly still, their compound eyes fixed on the Zarathi commander. The lumens had gone completely dark, something that only happened when they were in extreme distress. And the humans looked like they had just awakened from a long sleep. Mrs. Chen, the old woman who had watched Sarah draw pictures on the wall, spoke into the silence. Her voice was quiet but carried clearly across the room. Her name was Sarah Reeves, she said. She was 8 years old. She loved to draw trees and flowers. She shared her food with hungry children. She organized a memorial service for a worker who had no friends. She forgave the creature that killed her. One by one, other voices joined in. Her name was Sarah Reeves. She was 8 years old. She drew pictures of Earth. She sang songs about hope. She forgave her killer, Commander. Zethkar raised his weapon again. Silence. Return to your quarters immediately. But the voices continued. Every human in the room was speaking. Then the Threnody began clicking in rhythm with the words. The lumens began to glow softly, their light pulsing like a heartbeat. Her name was Sarah Reeves. For the first time in his career, Commander Zethkar felt something he had never experienced before. Fear. Not for his own safety, but for something larger. The workers were not behaving as they should. They were supposed to be cowed and frightened. Instead, they seemed to be remembering something. The guards began firing shock weapons into the crowd. But even as workers fell, others continued the chant. They carried their unconscious friends and returned to their quarters. But the words followed them into the corridors. Her name was Sarah Reeves. That night, in the human quarters, families gathered around Sarah's body. Elena and Marcus sat beside their daughter, holding her small hands. Other parents brought their children to say goodbye. The Threnodian lumens found ways to enter the human areas despite the security restrictions. Mrs. Chen began to tell stories about Earth, not the sad stories of conquest and loss that had been whispered before, but older stories. Stories about a species that had climbed out of caves and built cities. Stories about humans who had explored dangerous seas and hostile continents. Stories about a people who had learned to split atoms and touch the stars. We are not just workers, she said quietly. We are the children of Earth. We are the species that learned to dream and then made our dreams real. Marcus looked up from his daughter's still face. Something was changing inside him. The grief was still there, but it was transforming into something else, something harder and more focused. They killed her because she gave people hope, he said. They killed her because she reminded us who we used to be. Who we still are, added another voice. Who we will be again, said another. In the distance, alarms began to sound. 3 Zarathi guard stations had suffered simultaneous equipment failures. Communications across the colony were experiencing mysterious disruptions. Mining equipment was breaking down in ways that seemed almost coordinated. But Commander Zethkar did not yet understand what was happening. He thought the failures were random. He thought the workers would return to their normal routine once the shock of the 3 days after Sarah Reeves died. The first revolution began on a world called New Harmony. Dr. James Patterson was working in his laboratory when the message reached him. Hidden inside what appeared to be routine supply requests, coded in a language the Zarathi had never learned to read, was the story of a little girl who had forgiven her killer. James had been a weapons researcher before the conquest. Now he processed food supplements for Zarathi soldiers, but in the basement of the processing plant he had been building something else entirely. For 50 years, humans across the galaxy had been playing a game the Zarathi did not understand. They pretended to be broken. They acted weak and defeated. But in secret they remembered. They planned. They prepared. Sarah's death was the signal they had been waiting for. On mining colony Kepler 442b, Marcus Reeves had not slept since his daughter's funeral. He sat in the maintenance tunnel where he had once worked as a simple laborer. But Marcus had never been a simple laborer. Before the conquest, he had designed defense systems for Earth's military. Now he spread blueprints across the tunnel floor. Schematics for Zarathi weapons, power distribution maps for the colony, guard rotation schedules he had memorized over 5 years of careful observation. Elena found him there on the 4th day. She brought him food and water and sat beside him in the darkness. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. "What I should have done 50 years ago," Marcus replied. "What we all should have done." He showed her the plans. The Zarathi had made a crucial mistake. They had used human engineers to maintain their technology, because humans were naturally good at understanding complex systems, but they had never imagined that those same engineers might turn that knowledge against them. "There are 17 major systems that keep this colony running," Marcus explained. "Power generation, life support, communications, defense shields, gravity generators, water recycling, food production. If the right systems fail in the right order," Elena understood, "the colony becomes defenseless. And that's just the beginning, Marcus said. The Zarathi have been using human-designed technology for decades. They adapted our computers, our weapons, even our ship engines. They thought they were being clever, taking advantage of human innovation. He smiled for the first time since Sarah's death. It was not a pleasant smile. They never stopped to wonder if we had left ourselves back doors. Across the galaxy, similar conversations were happening on hundreds of worlds. Dr. Patterson on New Harmony was activating sleeper programs hidden in Zarathi computer systems. Captain Maria Santos on the fortress world of Draconis was rallying former Earth military officers who had spent 50 years pretending to be broken. Engineer Liu Wei on the shipyard moon of Titan's Rest was sabotaging the Zarathi fleet from the inside. The Zarathi had conquered humanity through superior technology and overwhelming force. But they had made the same mistake that many conquerors make. They had assumed that military defeat meant total defeat. They had never understood that humans are persistence, hunters by nature, creatures who will chase their prey across vast distances until it finally collapses from exhaustion. The Zarathi had just given humanity 50 years to catch up. On Kepler 442b, the revolution began at exactly 2300 hours on a Tuesday. Marcus had spent a week recruiting trustworthy allies from every species in the colony. The Threnodi could move through the air vents without being detected. The Lumens could overload electrical systems with their natural abilities. The humans could reprogram the automated systems. Working together, they struck 17 targets simultaneously. The power grid failed first. Emergency lighting came on, but it was fed by backup generators that Marcus had quietly sabotaged weeks earlier. Within minutes, the colony was in complete darkness. The communications array went down next. Commander Zethkar found himself unable to contact the orbital command station or call for reinforcements. The Threnodi had chewed through fiber optic cables in places no Zarathi guard could reach. The gravity generators failed in the guard barracks. Suddenly, dozens of Zarathi soldiers found themselves floating helplessly in zero gravity while their human prisoners, who had spent years working in variable gravity conditions, moved through the corridors with practiced ease. The water recycling system began producing a substance that smelled terrible, but was harmless to humans and their alien allies. However, it was toxic to Zarathi biology. Within hours, the occupying forces were desperately rationing their emergency water supplies. But the most devastating failure was in the orbital defense platform. Marcus had discovered that the Zarathi had installed their defensive systems using modified human software that still responded to certain Earth military command codes. At 0300 hours, the defense platform began firing on the Zarathi command ship in orbit. Commander Zethkar stood in his darkened office, listening to the sounds of chaos echoing through the colony. His shock weapons were useless without power to charge them. His guards were trapped in various parts of the facility by malfunctioning blast doors. And somewhere in the darkness he could hear voices singing. They were singing the song Sarah Reeves had taught the children, a simple melody from Earth about hope and friendship and better days to come. "Sir," came a voice from his doorway. One of his lieutenants had managed to reach him using emergency glow sticks for light. "We have multiple system failures throughout the colony. The orbital platform is firing on our ship. And, sir, the workers are singing." Zethkar felt cold fear spreading through his chest. "How many casualties among the guards?" "None, sir. They've been very careful not to hurt anyone." "It's like they want us alive." That was somehow more terrifying than if the rebels had been killing Zarathi soldiers. Dead enemies could be mourned and avenged. But these humans seemed to be playing by rules that Zethkar did not understand. In the human quarters, families worked together to tend to their wounded and coordinate their next moves. Mrs. Chen had become an unofficial leader, using her memories of Earth's old resistance movements to organize the rebellion. "Remember," she told the group, "we are not like them. We do not kill for revenge. We fight to protect our children and our future." Elena Reeves looked around the room at the faces gathered in the soft glow of improvised lighting. "Sarah would have wanted this," she said quietly. She always believed that even the worst people could become better. Marcus nodded. "We'll give them the chance to surrender. If they refuse." He left the sentence unfinished, but everyone understood. News of the Kepler 442b uprising spread quickly through the hidden networks. Other worlds began to move. On New Harmony, Dr. Patterson's virus infected the central Zarathi computer system. causing their automated factories to begin producing children's toys instead of weapons. On Draconis, Captain Santos led a perfectly coordinated assault that captured the fortress without firing a single shot. On Titan's Rest, Engineer Liu Wei convinced an entire Zarathi fleet to surrender by demonstrating that he could remotely detonate their ship's reactors at will. The Zarathi Empire, which had ruled through fear for 3 centuries, suddenly found itself facing an enemy that did not fear death. Worse, it was facing an enemy that had spent decades learning their weaknesses while pretending to be harmless. But the most shocking thing about the human uprising was not its effectiveness. It was its restraint. On world after world, human forces captured Zarathi installations without unnecessary bloodshed. They took prisoners instead of executing them. They offered medical care to wounded enemies. They treated captured civilians with respect and dignity. It was behavior so alien to Zarathi, thinking that many commanders assumed it was a trick. On Kepler 442b, the siege lasted 6 days. Commander Zethkar and his remaining forces were trapped in the central command building, while human-led forces controlled the rest of the colony. Several times Marcus Reeves broadcast surrender terms that were surprisingly generous. The Zarathi would be allowed to leave unharmed if they agreed to release all prisoners and never return. Zethkar refused each offer. He had been trained to believe that surrender was worse than death. He did not understand that the humans were trying to save his life. On the 7th day, Elena Reeves approached the command building under a flag of truce. She carried with her a drawing that Sarah had made weeks before her death. It showed Zarathi and humans working together to build something beautiful. "My daughter drew this," she told the guards at the entrance. She believed that enemies could become friends. She believed that forgiveness was stronger than revenge. Even at the end, she forgave the one who killed her. The guards looked at the drawing with confusion. One of them, a young Zarathi who had only recently been assigned to the colony, stared at it for a long time. "Why do you show us this?" he asked. "Because you have a choice," Elena replied. "You can keep fighting a war you cannot win, or you can help us build something better." Sarah believed that everyone deserves a second chance, even the ones who hurt her. That night, 17 Zarathi guards abandoned their posts and walked out of the command building with their hands raised. They were fed, given medical care, and treated with the same kindness that the fall of the Zarathi Empire began not with a single battle, but with 1,000,000 small betrayals. Admiral Kreshitar stood on the bridge of the flagship Dominator, watching reports flood in from across the galaxy. In just 3 weeks, 47 worlds had declared independence. Zarathi forces were being driven from systems they had held for centuries. Worse, their own technology was turning against them. "How is this possible?" he demanded of his intelligence chief. "These humans were defeated 50 years ago. Their military was destroyed. Their leaders were executed or enslaved." The intelligence officer's reptilian hands trembled as he accessed the reports. "Sir, it appears that their military was never truly destroyed. They scattered, went into hiding, took ordinary jobs as engineers, doctors, technicians, and laborers. For 50 years? Yes, sir. They have been planning this entire time." Admiral Kreshtar felt something cold in his stomach. The Zarathi had always prided themselves on being superior strategists. They planned campaigns decades in advance. But the humans had been planning for 5 decades while pretending to be broken and defeated. On the fortress world of Zerath Prime, the Empire's capital, emergency meetings were being held in the deepest bunkers. The ruling council had not faced a real threat to their power in 200 years. They were discovering that they had forgotten how to fight an enemy that did not fear them. "The humans are using our own weapons against us," reported General Vexthal. "Every ship, every defensive platform, every automated system that uses human-designed components has become unreliable. Our fleets are being destroyed by their own computers. Then we fight without computers," snarled Overlord Greshanak, supreme leader of the Empire. "We return to basic weapons and tactics." "Sir, our basic weapons are also based on human technology. We adapted their designs because they were superior to our own. If we abandon all human-derived technology, we will be fighting with weapons that are 3 centuries out of date." The Overlord's claws scraped against the metal table. In their arrogance, the Zarathi had made themselves dependent on the creativity and innovation of the very people they had enslaved. Now that dependence had become a fatal weakness, but the humans were not simply sabotaging Zarathi technology. They were replacing it. On Earth's moon, in a facility the Zarathi thought was a simple mining operation, thousands of humans worked in shifts that never stopped. For 50 years, they had been secretly building weapons, ships, and defensive systems using designs that improved on everything the Zarathi possessed. Commander Sarah, Chen, named after the little girl whose death had started the revolution, stood in the command center watching the first wave of human warships launch toward the outer colonies. These ships looked nothing like the vessels that had fought the Zarathi 50 years ago. They were sleek, fast, and equipped with weapons that could think for themselves. "All ships report ready for combat operations," announced her tactical officer. "The Liberation Fleet is at full strength." Sarah looked at the tactical display showing Zarathi positions throughout the galaxy. Red dots marked enemy strongholds that had seemed invincible just months ago. Now they looked like targets. "Signal to all ships," she commanded. "Remember Sarah Reeves. Remember what we fight for. We are not conquerors. We are liberators." The first major battle took place in the Vega system, where a massive Zarathi fleet guarded one of their most important industrial worlds. Admiral Kreshtar himself led the defense, confident that raw numbers would overcome whatever tricks the humans might try. He was commanding over 300 warships against a human force of only 80 vessels. The outcome should have been decided before the first shot was fired, but the human ships moved like nothing the Zarathi had ever seen. They seemed to anticipate every tactical decision before it was made. They struck at weak points in Zarathi formations with surgical precision. Most disturbing of all, they appeared to be sharing information instantly across their entire fleet. "How are they coordinating so perfectly?" Admiral Kreshtar demanded as he watched his battle line crumble. His sensor officer checked his readings twice before answering. "Sir, their ships appear to be singing to each other." "What?" "They are broadcasting on audio frequencies. Musical patterns, but the patterns contain embedded data streams that our computers cannot decode." Sarah Reeves had taught the children of Kepler 442b to communicate through songs. Now, 50 years later, human fleets were using musical communication protocols that the Zarathi could hear but not understand or disrupt. The Battle of Vega lasted 14 hours. When it ended, the Zarathi fleet was destroyed or captured, and Admiral Kreshtar found himself a prisoner aboard a human vessel. He expected to be tortured or executed. Instead, he was given medical care for his injuries and assigned to comfortable quarters. The human commander, a woman who introduced herself as Captain Maria Santos, visited him personally. "Why?" he asked her. "Why treat a defeated enemy with kindness?" Captain Santos showed him a small picture, a drawing of a tree with people holding hands beneath it. "A little girl drew this before your people killed her. She believed that enemies could become friends. We fight to honor her memory, not to repeat your mistakes." Admiral Kreshtar stared at the drawing. He had heard stories about the child whose execution had triggered the uprising. He had dismissed them as human propaganda. Now, looking at this simple picture drawn by an 8-year-old, he began to understand what the Zarathi had awakened. The humans were not fighting for conquest or revenge. They were fighting for the right to be human, the right to show kindness to children, the right to forgive their enemies, the right to hope for a better future. It was a kind of warfare the Zarathi had no defense against. As the war spread across the galaxy, the Zarathi discovered that they faced enemies everywhere. The Threnodi used their natural stealth abilities to sabotage installations from within. The Lumens overloaded power grids and communication networks. Dozens of other enslaved species rose up with human support and human weapons. But the most devastating attacks came from an unexpected source: young Zarathi soldiers who began to question everything they had been taught. Private Zeshkai was stationed on the mining world of Titan's Reach when the human fleet arrived. He had been trained to fight to the death rather than surrender. But when the human ships began broadcasting something instead of attacking, he found himself listening. They were broadcasting the story of Sarah Reeves. Not as propaganda, but as simple truth. An 8-year-old girl who had shared her food with hungry children, who had organized a memorial service for a dead alien worker, who had forgiven her killer even as she died. Private Zeshkai was 19 years old. He had never heard a story like that before. In Zarathi culture, weakness was despised and mercy was seen as failure. But this human child had shown strength of a kind he did not understand. When the human Marines landed, Zeshkai threw down his weapon and surrendered. He was not alone. Nearly half of the Zerathi garrison on Titan's Reach chose surrender over a battle they no longer believed in. On mining colony Kepler 442b, Marcus Reeves received daily reports from the liberation fleets. Each victory was dedicated to his daughter's memory. Each world freed from Zerathi control was offered the choice to join the growing alliance or remain independent. Elena had become the colony's new administrator, chosen by vote of all species represented there. She ran the government according to principles Sarah had embodied: fairness, compassion, and respect for all thinking beings. Commander Zethkar still lived on the colony, but not as a prisoner. He had chosen to stay and work alongside the people he had once oppressed. Every day he tended the memorial garden that had been planted where Sarah died. It was the only place on the rocky world where earth flowers had been successfully grown. "Why do you let me live here?" he asked Elena one day as they worked together planting new seedlings. "I killed your daughter." Elena was quiet for a long moment. "Because she forgave you," she finally said. "And because someone needs to remember what hatred costs. You remember better than anyone." Zethkar nodded and continued planting. His claws, once used for violence, were now stained with soil from Earth. It seemed fitting somehow. As the war entered its final phase, the Zerathi Empire controlled fewer than 50 worlds out of the thousands it had once dominated. Overlord Greshnak gathered his remaining forces for a desperate final battle around Zerath Prime itself. But even as his fleets prepared for war, something unprecedented happened. His own military officers began to surrender. Not just individual soldiers, but entire units led by their commanders. General Vexthal was among them. He had been a career military officer for over a century, but the stories of Sarah Reeves had reached even the capital world. Stories of a child who had chosen forgiveness over hatred, hope over despair. "I cannot fight for an empire that murders children," he announced to his troops. "I cannot serve leaders who see mercy as weakness." One by one, Zerathi military units declared for the rebellion. They were not joining the humans out of fear or for personal gain. They were joining because they wanted to be part of something better than what they had always known. When the human liberation fleet finally reached Zerath Prime, they found the planet's defenses manned by former Zerathi soldiers flying alongside human, Threnody, and Lumen crews. The war that had begun with the death of one innocent child was ending with former 5 years after the execution of Sarah Reeves. Representatives from 800 worlds gathered on New Geneva to sign the Galactic Concordat. The ceremony took place in a vast hall built from materials donated by every member species: Zerathi crystal, human steel, Threnody silk, and Lumen energy cores that provided soft, warm light. At the center of the hall stood a statue carved from a single piece of earth marble. It showed a small girl with her arms outstretched, as if offering an embrace to the entire galaxy. The inscription at its base was written in 47 languages, but the words were simple: "Sarah Reeves, she taught us to forgive." Marcus Reeves stood before the assembled delegates, wearing the simple blue uniform of the Concordat peacekeeping force. He had been elected as the first Director General by unanimous vote, though he had not wanted the position. The galaxy needed leaders who understood the cost of war and the value of peace. "We gather today not to celebrate victory," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "We gather to remember a lesson learned at terrible cost. My daughter died because she dared to show kindness in a cruel world. She died because she reminded people that they could choose to be better than their circumstances." In the audience, former enemies sat side by side. Admiral Kreshtar, now serving as the Zerathi representative to the Concordat, listened with tears in his reptilian eyes. Beside him, Captain Maria Santos nodded as she remembered the drawing Sarah had made of the tree and the people holding hands. "The Concordat we signed today is built on 3 principles," Marcus continued. "First, that all thinking beings have the right to live without fear. Second, that strength comes from cooperation, not domination. Third, that the protection of children and innocence is the highest duty of any civilized society." Elena Reeves stood at the back of the hall, watching her husband address the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. She carried with her a small bundle, copies of all the drawings Sarah had made during her short life. They would be placed in the Concordat archives as founding documents, alongside constitutions and treaties. The formal signing took 3 hours. Each world's representative approached the central table, and added their signature to the document that would govern relations between species for generations to come. As they signed, they each placed a small offering at the base of Sarah's statue, a flower, a stone, a piece of art, something that represented their commitment to the principles she had embodied. When the ceremony was complete, the hall erupted in applause that lasted for 10 minutes, but the real celebration was quieter and more profound. For the first time in galactic history, 800 different species had agreed to share power and responsibility equally. The Concordat government was unlike anything that had existed before. Instead of being ruled by the strongest military force, it was administered by councils where every species had an equal voice. Decisions were made through discussion and compromise rather than force and intimidation. The Zerathi homeworld of Zerath Prime had been transformed into a center for galactic education and research. Former military academies now taught diplomatic theory and conflict resolution. The planet that had once exported terror across the galaxy now exported teachers and peacekeepers. Overlord Greshanak had been the last Zerathi leader to surrender. When human forces finally reached his bunker, they found him alone and defeated, surrounded by the ruins of an empire that had lasted 3 centuries. He expected to be executed immediately. Instead, he was brought before a tribunal that included humans, Zerathi, and representatives from every species his empire had oppressed. The proceedings lasted 6 months and were broadcast across the galaxy. Greshanak was forced to confront the full scope of the suffering he had caused. But when the tribunal reached its verdict, they surprised him. Instead of execution, he was sentenced to spend the rest of his life teaching young Zerathi about the consequences of tyranny. He would live, but he would dedicate his remaining years to ensuring that future generations understood the price of ruling through fear. Even monsters can learn to be better. Elena Reeves had testified at his trial. My daughter believed that everyone deserves a chance to choose who they want to be. The transformation of galactic society was not without challenges. Centuries of mistrust and hatred could not be erased overnight. There were conflicts between species that had to be mediated. There were those who preferred the old ways of solving problems through violence. But the Concordat had something the old empire had never possessed: the willing cooperation of its members. When disputes arose, they were resolved through negotiation and compromise. When disasters struck, hundreds of worlds sent aid without being asked. When new technologies were developed, they were shared freely rather than hoarded for military advantage. Commander Sarah Chen, now Admiral Chen of the Concordat Defense Force, established the Sarah Protocols, military doctrines based on the principle that the best victory is one that turns enemies into friends. Concordat peacekeepers were trained not just in combat, but in mediation, cultural sensitivity, and conflict resolution. The results were remarkable. When the insectoid hive clusters on the galactic rim began raiding merchant ships, the Concordat response was not to destroy them, but to discover why they needed the resources they were stealing. It turned out their homeworlds were dying from environmental collapse. Instead of war, the galaxy got its first major terraforming project, with hundreds of species working together to save the hive worlds. When the energy beings of the Void Nebula began interfering with space travel, the response was not military retaliation but communication. It took 3 years to establish a translation protocol, but the result was first contact with a truly alien intelligence that had been trying to warn travelers about dangerous solar flares. On mining colony Kepler 442b, now renamed Sarah's Hope, the memorial garden had grown to cover several acres. Children from dozens of species played among the earth flowers while their parents worked together in new industries: art, music, literature, and scientific research. The colony that had once produced only raw materials for Zerathi war machines now produced beauty and knowledge. Commander Zethkar, now simply called Zeth, had become the garden's chief caretaker. He was an old Zerathi now, his scales gray with age, but he still tended the flowers every day. Children would often find him there, and they would ask him to tell them about the little girl who had changed everything. She was not special because she was brave, he would tell them. She was special because she was kind. Bravery is something you do when you have no choice. Kindness is something you choose even when it costs you everything. The children, Human and Zerathi and Threnody and Lumen, would listen to his stories and then run off to play together in the garden. They grew up not knowing that their species had once been enemies. To them, diversity was natural and cooperation was normal. Mrs. Chen had lived to see the signing of the Concordat, but passed away peacefully 2 years later. Her final words were about the children playing in the gardens of New Geneva. "Sarah's dream came true," she whispered. "They are all holding hands under the tree." The law that bore Sarah's name became the most important legislation in Concordat space. Sarah's law established that the protection of children and innocents took precedence over all other considerations, military, economic, or political. Any action that endangered children had to be approved by a special council that included child advocates from every member species. The law had been tested only once, when a terrorist group took hostages, including several children on a remote station. The Concordat response was swift and overwhelming, but it was designed to protect the innocents rather than simply destroy the terrorists. Every hostage was rescued safely, and even the terrorists were offered rehabilitation rather than execution. As Marcus Reeves aged, he often walked through the memorial garden on New Geneva, where a larger version of Sarah's tree had been planted. The tree was now 50 feet tall, its branches providing shade for benches where beings of all species could sit and remember the cost of hatred. Elena had died 3 years earlier. Her last words a message for their daughter. "Tell her we made the galaxy safe for children to dream." Marcus carried that message with him every day. When he spoke to schools, when he mediated disputes between worlds, when he signed legislation that would affect billions of lives, he asked himself one question: would this make Sarah proud? The answer guided every decision. On the 10th anniversary of the Concordat, the memorial service was held simultaneously on every member world. Billions of beings observed a moment of silence, then sang the song Sarah had taught the children of Kepler 442b. The melody carried across space through quantum communication networks, creating the largest choir in galactic history. Admiral Kreshtar, now in his final years, sat in the memorial garden on Zerath Prime and listened to the singing. He had spent the last decade teaching young Zerathi about the history their people preferred to forget. His students were different from the soldiers he had once commanded. Curious instead of aggressive, cooperative instead of dominating.